You see me?
Yeah. Yes, I see you. You see me?
Hell yeah, I see you. Both of us sitting here looking like two big Barneys. We see each other.
Tonight, we're learning more about the victim of a deadly domestic violence shooting on New Year's Day in Limestone County. Athens police say 26-year-old Alexis Garth died at Huntsville Hospital after being shot around 4 in the morning. New at 10, while the investigation is ongoing, we are hearing from Alexis's sister in an interview you'll see only on Way 31 News. Way 31's Brittany Harry reports from Athens.
Tonight, the family's still very much processing Alexis Garth's death. The 26-year-old died after she was shot multiple times by a man she once loved.
How he spoke, he loved my sister. So no, I didn't think it would come to this point at all. I didn't.
On January 1st, 2023, at 4 a.m. in Athens, Alabama, police were dispatched to a domestic disturbance call on Oakdale Ridge Lane, where they encountered 26-year-old Alexis Garth suffering multiple gunshot wounds in the driveway of her residence. Emergency responders transported her to Huntsville Hospital, where she died from her injuries several hours later. A 20-year-old man, Kaiwan Jameer Yarbrough, was detained at the scene and subsequently charged with capital murder for the fatal shooting. Court records show the charge was elevated due to the violent circumstances surrounding the incident and Yarbrough's prior criminal history. Investigators linked Garth's death to an escalating domestic dispute, now the subject of ongoing judicial proceedings. What began as a New Year's Day call for assistance would peel back layers of prior violence, legal decisions, and community concerns about domestic abuse. Stay with us as we unravel this shocking story and uncover the heartbreaking details of what led to this senseless loss. Before we begin, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And what are your thoughts as the story unfolds? Welcome to True Crime Tales, where we reveal the crimes that shock communities and the secrets hidden behind closed doors. These are real people, real events, real consequences. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's begin. Alexis Garth was a 26-year-old woman residing in Athens, Limestone County, Alabama, at the time of her death. She had lived in the Athens area for several years, establishing residence in a quiet residential neighborhood on Oakdale Ridge Lane. The area is characterized by single-family homes and limited overnight activity, with no history of frequent violent incidents reported in the immediate vicinity prior to January 2023. Alexis maintained close relationships with members of her family, including extended relatives who were familiar with her living situation and personal circumstances. Family connections remained active, with regular communication and involvement in her daily life. She was not known to be isolated from her relatives, and there is no indication that she had severed ties or withdrawn from her support network in the months leading up to the incident. In the period before January 1st, 2023, Alexis followed a relatively consistent daily routine. While specific employment details were not widely publicized, available information indicates she maintained structured day-to-day activities and social interactions typical of a young adult living independently. Her routine included time spent at home, communication with friends and family, and regular use of personal transportation. There is no documentation suggesting erratic behavior or sudden changes in lifestyle immediately prior to the incident. Her social environment consisted of a small personal network rather than a broad public presence. Alexis was known primarily within her local community and personal circles. She was not identified as a public figure, nor was she associated with activities that would typically attract law enforcement attention. Those familiar with her described her as maintaining ordinary social connections without indications of ongoing public disputes. Alexis's relationship history is central to understanding the circumstances of the case. At the time of her death, she was involved in an intimate relationship with Kaiwan Jameer Yarbrough. The relationship was known to individuals close to her and was active in the period leading up to the shooting. Records do not indicate that Alexis had obtained formal protective orders or restraining orders related to this relationship. Regarding domestic circumstances, the residence on Oakdale Ridge Lane functioned as a shared or frequently occupied space connected to both Alexis and Yarbrough. While there is no public record of long-term police monitoring of the address, the fatal incident itself was classified as domestic in nature, indicating that the conflict originated within a personal relationship rather than an external confrontation. There is no confirmed documentation of Alexis having filed formal domestic violence complaints prior to January 1st, 2023. Similarly, there is no record of active protective measures, such as court-ordered separation, restraining orders, or relocation to a protective facility. This absence does not indicate the absence of conflict, but establishes that no formal legal safeguards were in place at the time. The relationship between Alexis Garth and Kyrwan Jameer Yarbrough was identified by investigators as an intimate domestic relationship. The two were known to have ongoing personal involvement prior to the shooting. The length of their relationship has not been fully detailed in public court summaries, but evidence suggests it was not a brief or incidental association. At the time of the incident, living arrangements placed both individuals at or around the same residence. Whether the home was jointly leased or primarily associated with Alexis has not been definitively clarified in publicly released records. What is clear is that Yarbrough was present at the residence during the early morning hours of January 1st, 2023. Prior conflicts between the two were not extensively documented through formal police reports before the fatal incident. However, the classification of the call as a domestic disturbance indicates that the confrontation was not spontaneous between strangers. Domestic disputes often involve prior unresolved conflicts, even when those conflicts have not resulted in earlier police intervention. Patterns consistent with escalating domestic instability can be inferred from the sequence of events rather than from a long record of reported incidents. The escalation occurred within a private setting during overnight hours, a time frame commonly associated with reduced external oversight and delayed intervention. The presence of a firearm during the dispute marked a critical escalation point. Warning signs, if observed by acquaintances or neighbors, were not formally recorded prior to January 1st. Neighbors did not report repeated disturbances from the residents in earlier months. This lack of outward disruption contributed to the absence of earlier law enforcement involvement. In the hours immediately preceding the shooting, interactions between Alexis and Yarbrough took place within the residence. Communications, whether verbal or electronic, have not been publicly detailed. What is known is that the situation progressed to a level that prompted a call to emergency services, indicating that the dispute had moved beyond a private disagreement. Kyrwan Jameer Yarbrough was 20 years old at the time of the shooting and resided in Athens, Alabama. He had established ties to the local area and was not a transient individual. His family and social background placed him within the same regional community as Alexis Garth. Prior to January 2023, Yarbrough had an existing criminal record. His history included previous convictions involving firearms, marking him as a known offender within the criminal justice system. These prior offenses were significant enough to result in incarceration and subsequent probation. At the time of the shooting, Yarbrough was under probationary supervision. Conditions of his release included compliance with legal restrictions and oversight by correctional authorities. The supervision was active, meaning he had been released from custody not long before the incident occurred. The timeline of his release from custody indicates that he had returned to the community shortly before January 1st, 2023. This proximity between release and reoffense became a point of scrutiny during later court proceedings. Despite his probationary status, Yarbrough had access to a firearm, raising questions about enforcement of release conditions. Yarbrough's known behavioral patterns included prior violent conduct involving weapons. His interactions with law enforcement before this case established familiarity with the criminal justice system. These interactions were not isolated events, but part of a documented pattern of behavior that predated the fatal shooting. On December 31st, 2022, activities at the residence followed the calendar transition into the new year. There is no public indication that large gatherings or external events took place at the home that night. The environment was consistent with a residential setting during overnight hours. As New Year's Eve transitioned into New Year's Day, interactions between Alexis Garth and Kyrwan Yarbrough continued inside the residence. Communications between the two have not been fully disclosed, but the escalation occurred during early morning hours when most surrounding residents were inactive. No confirmed reports indicate that neighbors contacted authorities before the final emergency call. The absence of earlier calls suggests the dispute intensified rapidly rather than over an extended period of audible disturbance. The escalation timeline culminated shortly before 4 a.m. when emergency services were contacted. Environmental factors included low visibility, limited external witnesses, and reduced neighborhood activity. These conditions contribute to the incident unfolding largely without immediate outside intervention. When police arrived, the situation had already reached its most critical point, marking the end of the escalation phase and the beginning of the formal investigation. In the early morning hours of January 1st, 2023, emergency dispatch in Athens, Alabama, received a call reporting a domestic disturbance at a residence on Oakdale Ridge Lane. The call indicated an active situation involving an argument inside the home. Based on the information provided to dispatch, the incident was categorized as a domestic-related call requiring immediate law enforcement response. Police units were dispatched within minutes of the call being logged. Standard priority procedures were followed due to the domestic nature of the report, which carries a recognized risk of escalation. Officers were routed directly to the address provided by the caller. Upon arrival at Oakdale Ridge Lane, responding officers observed an individual later identified as Alexis Lapirian Garth lying in the driveway area of the residence. She was unresponsive and had visible gunshot wounds. Officers immediately assessed the scene for threats before approaching the victim to provide assistance. Alexis Garth was found outside the residence, positioned near the driveway rather than inside the home. Her location suggested the incident may have extended beyond the interior of the residence or that she had moved outside following the shooting. Officers noted that she was suffering from multiple gunshot injuries and required urgent medical attention. Immediate medical actions were initiated at the scene. Officers requested emergency medical services while rendering basic life-saving measures consistent with their training. This included checking for signs of life, attempting to control bleeding where possible, and maintaining scene awareness while awaiting paramedics. At the same time, officers identified a male individual at the scene, later confirmed as Kyrwan Jameer Yarbrough. He was located on the property and detained without incident. Officers secured him to prevent flight and to ensure scene safety while the investigation began. Scene security procedures were implemented immediately. The residence and surrounding area were secured, access was restricted, and additional units were called to establish a perimeter. This ensured the integrity of the scene and prevented contamination of potential evidence. Other individuals were present in the vicinity, including residents of the home and nearby neighbors. Officers separated witnesses to prevent communication between them and began preliminary identification. Witnesses were instructed to remain available for statements. Physical evidence was observed at the scene, including spent shell casings and indications of gunfire near the driveway and entryway of the residence. Officers documented these observations without disturbing the items, pending formal crime scene processing. Emergency medical personnel arrived on scene shortly after law enforcement secured the area. Alexis Garth was assessed and determined to be in critical condition due to the severity of her injuries. She was prepared for immediate transport. She was transported by ambulance to Huntsville Hospital, the nearest trauma-equipped medical facility. During transport, paramedics continued life-saving interventions consistent with gunshot trauma protocols, including airway management and hemorrhage control. Medical personnel documented that Garth had sustained multiple gunshot wounds. The precise number and placement of the injuries were later detailed in medical and forensic reports. The injuries were determined to be life-threatening upon arrival at the hospital. Hospital staff initiated emergency treatment in an effort to stabilize her condition. This included surgical intervention attempts, blood transfusions, and other advanced trauma care measures. Despite these efforts, her condition continued to deteriorate. Alexis Garth was pronounced dead several hours after arrival at the hospital. The time of death was recorded in official medical records. Law enforcement was notified immediately following the pronouncement. An official cause of death was later determined by medical authorities. The cause was ruled homicide, resulting from complications associated with multiple gunshot wounds. This determination was communicated to investigators and formed the basis for the homicide investigation. Following the victim's transport, investigators initiated a full crime scene investigation at Oakdale Ridge Lane. The residence, driveway, and surrounding outdoor areas were processed methodically. Crime scene technicians documented the scene through photography, measurements, and written notes. The positions of physical evidence, including shell casings and other ballistic-related items, were recorded prior to collection. Ballistics evidence was recovered and cataloged. This included spent shell casings and any projectile fragments located during the search. Investigators also sought to locate the firearm believed to have been used in the shooting. Forensic documentation included bloodstain pattern observations, trajectory analysis, and examination of damage to the residence or surrounding property. These findings were used to assist in reconstructing the sequence of events. Digital evidence was collected as part of the investigation. This included mobile phones belonging to involved parties, which were preserved for later forensic analysis. Investigators also sought call logs, text messages, and other electronic communications relevant to the events leading up to the incident. Statements were obtained from individuals present at or near the scene. Witnesses provided accounts of what they heard or observed prior to law enforcement arrival. These statements were recorded and compared for consistency. Based on physical evidence and witness accounts, investigators began reconstructing the shooting sequence. This reconstruction focused on where the shooting occurred, the movement of involved individuals, and the timing of events relative to the emergency call. Following initial detention, Khairwan Jameer Yarbrough was formally placed under arrest. Arrest procedures were conducted in accordance with department policy, including advising him of his rights. He was transported from the scene for processing and later booked into custody. Law enforcement compiled preliminary investigative findings and submitted them to the appropriate prosecutorial authority. Initial charges were filed based on the evidence collected and the circumstances of the death. The offense was legally classified as capital murder under Alabama law. The basis for the capital murder designation included the nature of the killing, the use of a firearm, and specific statutory factors applicable to domestic-related homicides. Additional considerations included the suspect's legal status at the time of the incident. Factors influencing charge severity included prior criminal history, the presence of multiple gunshot wounds, and the location and circumstances under which the shooting occurred. Prosecutors evaluated these factors when determining appropriate charges. Following his arrest, Yarbrough was held in custody pending further court proceedings. Bond eligibility was addressed through judicial review, and detention status was determined based on the seriousness of the charge and statutory guidelines. The case then transitioned from an active investigation into the pretrial phase of the criminal justice process, where further legal proceedings would determine the outcome. Following the January 1st, 2023 shooting death of Alexis Lapirian Garth, Khairwan Jameer Yarbrough was formally brought before the court for his initial appearance. During this proceeding, the court confirmed the defendant's identity, reviewed the charges filed by prosecutors, and informed him of his legal rights. The charge entered at this stage was capital murder, reflecting the seriousness of the alleged offense and the circumstances surrounding the killing. The court also verified that the defendant understood the nature of the charge and the potential consequences attached to it. No arguments regarding guilt or innocence were presented during this appearance, as its primary purpose was procedural. The court further confirmed that the defendant would remain in custody pending additional hearings. Legal representation was addressed, and the case was scheduled for subsequent review under Alabama's pretrial detention framework. A central feature of the early legal process was the application of Anaya's law, an Alabama statute that allows courts to deny bond to individuals charged with certain violent offenses. Prosecutors requested that the defendant be held without bond, citing the nature of the charge, the alleged use of a firearm, and the defendant's prior criminal history. During the hearing, the court examined whether the statutory requirements for denying bond were met. This included evaluating whether the defendant posed a significant threat to public safety and whether conditions of release could reasonably mitigate that risk. The court also reviewed documentation related to the defendant's prior convictions and probationary status at the time of the shooting. After considering the arguments and evidence presented, the judge ruled that the defendant would be held without bond. The decision placed the case among a limited category of violent felony prosecutions subject to pretrial detention under Anaya's law. Prosecutors outlined a structured argument centered on three primary factors: the severity of the offense, the defendant's criminal background, and public safety considerations. They emphasized that the alleged act involved the use of a firearm during a domestic dispute, resulting in a fatal outcome. Prosecutors also referenced the defendant's prior involvement in violent offenses and noted that he was under probation supervision at the time of the incident. Another key component of the prosecution's argument focused on the risk of reoffending. Prosecutors asserted that the defendant's history demonstrated a pattern of escalating violence and noncompliance with court-imposed conditions. Based on these factors, they argued that no combination of release conditions would adequately protect the community or ensure compliance with future court proceedings. The prosecution further maintained that the legal threshold for capital murder had been met, exposing the defendant to the highest level of criminal liability under state law. Defense counsel challenged the prosecution's characterization of risk and argued that pretrial detention without bond should be applied narrowly. The defense emphasized that the defendant had not yet been convicted of the charge and was entitled to presumption of innocence. They also argued that prior convictions alone should not automatically justify denial of bond. Defense attorneys suggested that supervised release, electronic monitoring, or other restricted conditions could address public safety concerns. They raised procedural objections regarding the interpretation of Anaya's law and urged the court to consider alternatives to continued detention. Despite these arguments, the defense did not dispute the occurrence of the shooting at this stage, focusing instead on legal standards governing bond eligibility rather than factual determinations of guilt. After reviewing the arguments, the judge issued rulings addressing bond, detention, and case management. The court found that prosecutors had met their burden under Anaya's law to demonstrate that the defendant posed a significant threat if released. As a result, bond was formally denied. The judge also affirmed the capital murder charge as procedurally valid and scheduled the case for further hearings, including preliminary motions and evidentiary review. The ruling clarified that the defendant would remain in custody unless future court decisions altered his detention status. Following the bond decision, the court established a procedural timeline. This included dates for discovery exchanges, pretrial motions, and potential suppression hearings. The scheduling reflected the complexity of a capital case, allowing extended time for both sides to prepare. No trial date was immediately set, consistent with standard practice in serious felony prosecutions. The court indicated that additional hearings would address evidentiary disputes, witness lists, and any motions related to the admissibility of prior acts. If convicted, the defendant faces sentencing exposure consistent with a capital murder charge under Alabama law. This includes a possibility of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The court made clear that sentencing determinations would depend on trial outcomes, statutory aggravating factors, and jury findings. As details of the case became public, attention turned to the defendant's probation status at the time of the shooting. Records showed that he had previously been convicted of a firearm-related offense and was released under supervision shortly before the incident. This raised questions about monitoring practices, compliance checks, and enforcement mechanisms. Institutional scrutiny extended to the decisions that allowed the defendant to be released prior to January 2023. This included examination of sentencing discretion, probation terms, and whether risk assessments adequately reflected the defendant's history. Observers noted potential gaps in supervision, including the lack of immediate response to prior violations and limited intervention mechanisms. The case highlighted challenges faced by probation departments managing high-risk individuals with limited resources. The timeline revealed points at which intervention may have been possible, including stricter probation enforcement or alternative sentencing structures. These moments became focal points in broader discussions about system performance rather than individual blame. Taken together, the case exposed structural vulnerabilities within supervision, release decision-making, and domestic violence risk management. The outcome intensified scrutiny of how violent offenders are assessed and managed prior to catastrophic incidents. Residents of the Oakdale Ridge Lane area reported concern over the presence of violent crime in a residential neighborhood. Many expressed surprise at the incident, noting that the area had not previously been associated with similar events. Law enforcement officials emphasized that the response followed established protocols and reiterated the importance of reporting domestic disturbances early. They acknowledged the broader challenges associated with preventing domestic violence escalation. Advocacy groups pointed to the case as an example of how domestic violence situations can escalate rapidly. They highlighted the importance of early intervention and cross-agency coordination. The case prompted renewed discussion about firearm access, probation oversight, and risk assessment for individuals with violent histories. Public officials faced questions regarding prevention strategies and accountability. Media coverage framed the case around legal accountability, system failures, and the application of Anaya's law. Reporting emphasized procedural developments rather than speculation, maintaining focus on verified court actions. The killing of Alexis Lapirian Garth did not occur in isolation. It unfolded within a broader pattern of domestic violence incidents documented across Limestone County, Alabama. Law enforcement agencies in the county routinely respond to domestic disturbance calls involving intimate partners, many of which include prior histories of conflict, restraining orders, or probationary supervision. While not all domestic incidents escalate to fatal outcomes, data from similar cases shows that repeated exposure to violence and access to firearms significantly increases the risk of homicide. Firearm-related domestic homicides represent a recurring category within violent crime statistics in the region. In many documented cases, the suspect legally or illegally possessed a firearm despite prior criminal convictions or active probation status. These incidents often raise questions about firearm access enforcement, probation monitoring, and the thresholds required to prevent escalation. When a domestic dispute involves a firearm, the likelihood of fatal injury increases substantially compared to cases involving physical assault alone. The legal system relies on specific thresholds to determine pretrial detention. Under Alabama law, violent offenses, such as capital murder, allow courts to deny bond, particularly when the suspect is deemed a threat to public safety. However, these thresholds are typically applied after an incident occurs. Prior to that point, supervision mechanisms depend on probation compliance, reporting requirements, and judicial discretion. In cases like this, scrutiny often centers on whether earlier legal intervention could have changed the outcome. Policy implications arise when a suspect has a documented violent history and remains in the community under supervision. This case highlights concerns regarding probation oversight, firearm possession restrictions, and information sharing between agencies. Similar cases in Alabama and other states have prompted legislative review, including expanded use of preventive detention laws and stricter enforcement of probation conditions for violent offenders. Comparisons to similar cases reveal consistent patterns. In multiple domestic homicide cases, suspects were previously known to the criminal justice system, had prior firearm-related offenses, or were under court supervision. These cases often follow a sequence of escalating incidents rather than a single, isolated act. The Garth case aligns with this broader pattern, placing it within a larger framework of systemic risk factors rather than an unpredictable anomaly. Despite available records and court filings, several critical questions remain unresolved. One of the central issues is whether any interventions could have altered the outcome. This includes examining probation supervision practices, firearm access restrictions, and whether law enforcement or judicial authorities had sufficient information to act preemptively. Another unresolved issue concerns warning signs. Domestic violence cases frequently present indicators, such as prior disputes, escalating behavior, or criminal history involving violence. The extent to which these indicators were documented, communicated, or acted upon remains unclear. Determining whether warning signs were adequately addressed requires a comprehensive review of prior law enforcement interactions, probation reports, and court decisions. Accountability within the justice system is also a focal point. This does not refer solely to individual actions, but to institutional processes. Questions arise regarding supervision standards, compliance checks, and enforcement consistency. When a suspect with a known violent background commits a fatal act while under supervision, it prompts examination of how accountability is distributed across agencies. Ongoing legal uncertainties further complicate the case. At various stages, court proceedings may involve motions related to evidence admissibility, prior convictions, or procedural compliance. These uncertainties affect the timeline of the case and the clarity of its eventual resolution. Until the judicial process concludes, several factual and legal determinations remain pending. As of the most recent procedural developments, The case remains within the judicial system under a capital murder charge. The suspect is being held without bond, following a determination that pretrial release would pose a risk to public safety. The case has progressed through initial hearings, with further proceedings anticipated. Anticipated trial developments include evidentiary hearings, witness testimony, and forensic analysis presentation. Prosecutors are expected to focus on establishing intent, firearm use, and the sequence of events leading to the fatal shooting. Defense strategies may involve challenging procedural elements, prior evidence admissibility, or contextual factors surrounding the incident. Possible outcomes range from conviction on the current charge to lesser included offenses, depending on trial findings and judicial rulings. Sentencing implications vary significantly, with capital murder carrying the most severe penalties under Alabama law. Any plea negotiations or charge modifications would be subject to court approval and prosecutorial discretion. Beyond the courtroom, the case holds long-term implications for policy and enforcement. Outcomes may influence how probation cases involving violent histories are handled, how firearm restrictions are enforced, and how domestic violence risks are assessed. Lawmakers and legal professionals often reference cases like this when evaluating the effectiveness of existing statutes and supervision models. The verified facts of this case establish a clear timeline. Alexis Lapirian Garth was fatally shot during a domestic incident in Athens, Alabama, on January 1st, 2023. A suspect with documented criminal history was detained at the scene and charged with capital murder. The legal process that followed has involved detention, without bond, and ongoing court proceedings. Documenting the full timeline is essential for understanding how the incident occurred and what factors contributed to it. Each phase, from prior supervision to emergency response and judicial action, provides insight into mechanisms that govern violent crime prevention and accountability. This case matters beyond Athens, Alabama, because it reflects broader systemic challenges present in many jurisdictions. Domestic violence, firearm access, probation oversight, and pretrial detention policies intersect in ways that directly affect public safety. The final emphasis remains on transparency and accountability. Accurate documentation, procedural review, and public awareness are critical to evaluating how similar incidents may be prevented in the future. By examining the facts without omission or distortion, this case contributes to a larger discussion about risk assessment, enforcement, and the responsibilities of the justice system. If you found this story as gripping and heartbreaking as we did, don't forget to like this video and share it with others. And if you want to hear more true crime stories that uncover the mysteries behind these tragic events, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell. You won't want to miss our latest stories, updates, and discussions. Thank you for joining us on this journey to seek justice and explore the truth. Together, we can make a difference. Until next time, stay safe and stay aware.